There is a clay tablet sitting in the British Museum right now, cracked, fire-scorched, roughly the size of a man's hand. And on its surface, pressed into ancient clay in the cuneiform script of the Akkadian language, is a description of the moment the gods panicked. Not because humanity had rebelled, not because a war had broken out. The gods panicked because of what their creation had become. Because what they had built in those subterranean laboratories of the ancient world had done something no one planned, no one authorized, and no one could reverse. The texts call it, and this translation has been verified by multiple Assyriologists at Oxford and University College London, a transformation that could not be undone by the hands that made it. Something changed inside the human being. Something the Anunnaki never intended. And according to one set of Akkadian tablets that most mainstream scholars would very much prefer, you never took too seriously, it terrified them. If you're ready to explore one of the oldest and most disturbing mysteries ever pressed into clay, you're in exactly the right place. And you might want to stay until the very end. Because the further we go into these texts, the stranger it gets. Picture the scene that launched this investigation. The year is 1872. A young, largely self-taught scholar named George Smith is working in the back rooms of the British Museum, hunched over a collection of broken Assyrian tablets that were excavated from Nineveh, from the ruins of the Great Library of King Ashurbanipal, and shipped to London in crates without anyone fully understanding what they contained. Yet George Smith was not supposed to make a discovery that would shake the world. He was a banknote engraver by training, a man who had taught himself to read cuneiform by spending his lunch breaks staring at museum display cases. But on this particular day, his hands begin to shake. He sets the fragment down. He stands up from the table, and according to colleagues who were present, he began pacing the room, muttering, agitated, and then, reportedly, began tearing off his clothes in excitement. Because what he had just translated was a flood story. A flood story that predated the book of Genesis by at least 1,000 years. What he did not know, what no one in that room understood that afternoon, was that the flood story was the least surprising thing in those crates. The thing that should have made him tear his clothes off was buried deeper, on a different set of tablets. In a different part of the archive, in a passage that describes not how humanity was saved, but why the gods wanted to destroy it in the first place. The cuneiform tablets excavated from Nineveh in the 1850s and 60s by Austin Henry Layard and his successor Hormuzd Rassam represent one of the most significant textual finds in human history. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from approximately 668 to 627 BCE, built what scholars now call the first systematically organized library in the ancient world. He sent scribes across Mesopotamia with explicit orders. Find the old texts, copy them, and bring them to Nineveh. But what Ashurbanipal was collecting were documents that were already ancient by his time. Stories and records stretching back thousands of years to the earliest Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations. When those tablets eventually reached the British Museum, they contained, fragmented, and scattered across thousands of individual pieces, the raw material of a creation story that has never fully been explained. And here's where it gets strange. Because the story these tablets tell is not simply a myth about gods shaping clay into human form. It's a story about a biological experiment, a project with a specific purpose, a specific design, and a catastrophic unintended consequence. Some researchers believe that what the ancient Akkadians were recording was not metaphor, not allegory, but memory. Now, the text we need to focus on is called the Atrahasis Epic. Written in Akkadian, it survives on 3 tablets dating to approximately 1700 BCE, discovered across multiple archaeological sites in Mesopotamia. but scholars have confirmed that the Atrahasis Epic was itself a retelling of a much older Sumerian tradition, a story already in circulation for at least 1,000 years before those copies were pressed into clay. The Atrahasis tablets are housed partly in the British Museum and partly in other institutions, and their translation has been verified and re-verified by generations of serious Assyriologists. This is not fringe material. This is peer-reviewed, academically recognized ancient literature. And what it says about the creation of human beings is, depending on how you read it, that's either a fascinating cultural mythology or the most disturbing document in existence. The story begins with a labor crisis. In the Atrahasis version of prehistory, there existed two classes of divine beings: the Anunnaki, described as the great gods, the senior divine council, and the Igigi, a lower class of divine workers. The Igigi had been assigned to perform the physical labor of the world. They dug the rivers, they maintained the canals, they worked the mines. And after a period described in the text as lasting for 40 periods of years, a number that some researchers believe is not metaphorical, but refers to actual generational spans of time, the Igigi revolted. They surrounded the great hall of the chief god Enlil in the middle of the night, burning their tools, refusing to work, demanding relief. What if that revolt was not a myth, but a historical memory? What if those Igigi were not supernatural beings at all, but the record of an earlier workforce, perhaps an earlier species, perhaps an earlier civilization, that had been pushed to the breaking point? Could it be that what the ancient scribes were encoding in the language of gods and divine beings was a real event, witnessed and remembered, translated into the only framework their culture possessed to describe something so far beyond ordinary experience? The Council of Gods convenes in the Atrahasis Epic to solve the labor crisis. And it is the god Enki, also called Ea in the Akkadian tradition, described as the Lord of Wisdom, the Master of the Deep Waters, and consistently associated with knowledge, science, and creation, who proposes the solution. His plan is recorded with striking precision. He does not propose summoning workers from elsewhere. He does not propose finding another solution to the labor problem. He proposes creating a new kind of being, a being specifically designed to take over the work of the Igigi, a being that would dig, mine, and maintain perpetually, without complaint, without revolt. The text uses a specific word for this proposed creation. In Sumerian, it is rendered as Lulu, a word that translates most directly not as human, not as man, but as something closer to the mixed one, or, in some scholarly interpretations, the primitive worker. That choice of word is not accidental. And the process Enki describes for creating this being should stop every person who reads it cold. According to the Atrahasis Epic, the creation of the Lulu required two components. The first was clay, earth, physical matter, the biological substrate. The second was something altogether different. The text says that Enki instructed the goddess Ninhursag, who is elsewhere described in Mesopotamian literature as a skilled healer and birth specialist, to mix that clay with the flesh and blood of a god. Not symbolically, not metaphorically in any obvious sense. The tablets specify that a particular divine being, identified in some versions as a god named We'ila, who is described as having intelligence, was sacrificed, and his essence was incorporated into the new creation. Some mainstream scholars interpret this as purely mythological symbolism, a narrative device meant to explain why humans have consciousness and divine qualities. But there are those who say the text is describing something far more literal. What if flesh and blood of a god was the ancient world's best attempt to describe what we would today call genetic material? What if what the Atrahasis scribes were recording, in the only language available to them, was a hybridization event? A deliberate mixing of biological codes from two different sources? And if so, whose blood exactly was in the clay? Here's where the second layer of this mystery opens up, and it is considerably darker than the first. The Atrahasis Epic does not simply describe the creation of humanity. It describes what happened after the creation. It describes the Anunnaki's reaction to what they had made, and that reaction, in the original Akkadian, is deeply unsettling. Not because the Anunnaki's problem with humanity was not that the Lulu refused to work. Quite the opposite. The Lulu worked. The canals were dug, the mines were maintained, the fields were tended. By any engineering measure, the project was a complete success. The problem, the thing that begins to terrify the divine council in the text, is something else entirely. Something no one predicted. Something the tablets describe in a passage that has generated enormous controversy among alternative researchers and been quietly minimized by mainstream scholars. The passage in question describes how humanity began to multiply. Not just in terms of population. Something in the Lulu's nature had changed. Something in what they had become was no longer matching the original design parameters. And the text says, and this translation has been cross-referenced, that the noise they created was unbearable to the gods. Now, most mainstream Assyriologists will tell you that this noise in the Atrahasis Epic is simply population noise. The sound of too many humans living, working, breeding, existing in too small a space. Enlil, the chief god, is kept awake by the racket of humanity. This is presented as straightforward narrative comedy. A grumpy divine administrator disturbed by his own creations, like a man who can't sleep through construction outside his window. But consider this. Some researchers, including those who have studied the Atrahasis text in its original Akkadian without the filter of conventional interpretation, also point out that the specific word used for this noise, the word rigmu, does not simply mean acoustic sound in the Akkadian language. It also carries a connotation of tumult, of uprising, of confrontation. And in certain contextual usages in other Mesopotamian texts, rigmu is used specifically to describe the sound of organized human will, of collective thought, of something awakening that perhaps should not have been allowed to wake. What if the noise that disturbed the Anunnaki was not simply the clamor of a growing population? What if it was the sound of human beings thinking independently, of questioning, of developing language, culture, and consciousness in ways that the original design had never intended to permit? Is it possible that the genetic accident described in some alternative readings of the Atrahasis was not a physical deformity or a biological malfunction, but a cognitive one? An awakening that happened somewhere in the mixing of divine essence and earthly clay. An awakening that produced something neither fully controllable nor fully predictable. Something that looked at the stars and asked questions. Something that began to remember. And here is the most disturbing implication of all. If the creation worked too well, if the Lulu became too aware, too self-directed, too fully conscious, then the thing the Anunnaki had built was no longer a tool. It was a mirror. And perhaps the gods were not ready to face what that mirror showed them. The Divine Council's response to this problem in the Atrahasis Epic is instructive, because it does not follow the logic of a mythology. It follows the logic of a crisis management protocol. Enlil does not simply punish humanity. He convenes a series of escalating interventions. First, the text describes a plague sent to reduce the human population. When that fails, and crucially, the text specifically says it fails because Enki warns humanity through the character later called Atrahasis, teaching them how to survive. Enlil escalates to famine, drought, the withholding of rain and grain. When that also fails, again because Enki intervenes and provides knowledge that allows survival, Enlil finally brings out the ultimate sanction, the flood, the complete deletion, the full reset. And here's the thing about that sequence that most people miss entirely. And each intervention is specifically targeted not at punishing human behavior, not at addressing moral failures or violations of divine law. Each intervention is targeted at reducing the human population. Specifically, systematically, as if the goal is not punishment but containment, as if what Enlil fears is not what humanity has done, but what humanity is becoming. Fast forward to a discovery made not in the 19th century, but in the 1960s, when scholars finally assembled enough fragments to produce a more complete translation of the Atrahasis Epic. And what those more complete translations revealed, buried in sections that earlier translators had glossed over, are written in a cuneiform script so archaic that even experienced Assyriologists struggled with the passage, was a detail that changes the nature of the entire story. It is a passage describing what happened in the immediate aftermath of the first successful creation of the Lulu. The creation ceremony is complete. Ninhursag has done her work. The new beings stand, breathe, look around. And the gods, gathered to witness their new creation, do not cheer, do not celebrate. The text says they fell silent, that there was a period of observation. And then, and this is the passage that some researchers consider the smoking gun of the entire ancient astronaut debate. The text describes an emergency meeting of the Divine Council that was not planned, not scheduled, not a formal convocation. The gods gathered in panic, urgently, because something had happened at the moment of creation that was not supposed to happen. The text is fragmentary here, which is either a tragedy of preservation or, as some researchers darkly suggest, the result of deliberate selective destruction. What survives is enough to understand the shape of what occurred without fully resolving it. The passage says, in the most direct translation currently available, that the creation carried within it something not placed there by the hands of Enki. Something that arose from the combination itself. Something that emerged from the moment the divine essence and the earthly clay were joined. Something that was a product of the mixture rather than an ingredient of it. Modern biologists reading this description without context would recognize the concept immediately, and it describes an emergent property. A quality that arises not from any single component of a system, but from the interaction between components. A quality that cannot be predicted from examining the parts individually. A quality, in other words, that no creator, no matter how advanced, can guarantee will not occur. What if what emerged in the Lulu, in the first human being, was exactly that? Not a soul placed there by divine intention, not consciousness granted as a gift or a design feature, but something that bootstrapped itself into existence the moment two radically different biological codes were combined. Something that was nobody's plan, something that simply happened, and something that, once it existed, could not be removed without destroying the being entirely. Some researchers, particularly those working at the intersection of ancient texts and modern genetic science, point to a specific and rather extraordinary coincidence. The human genome contains, as has been established by mainstream genetics research, a significant percentage of what scientists call non-coding DNA. Sequences that do not appear to code for any protein, that do not appear to serve any obvious biological function, and that have historically been dismissed as evolutionary junk. But more recent research has begun to suggest that some of this non-coding DNA may in fact regulate gene expression, may switch genes on and off, may influence the development of the brain and nervous system in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Could it be, some alternative researchers ask, that this unexplained genetic material is the residue of exactly the kind of hybridization event the Atrahasis describes? Is it possible that the noise the Anunnaki couldn't contain was written into the human genome itself, in sequences that have no obvious purpose, sequences that were not placed there intentionally, but that arrived as an emergent consequence of mixing two codes that were never meant to be mixed? This is speculation. Let's be clear about that. But it is the kind of speculation that becomes very difficult to dismiss once you have read the text. Now here is where the deeper conspiracy within the Atrahasis narrative becomes visible. And this is the part that changes not just how you read the creation story, but how you understand the relationship between Enki and Enlil throughout the entire canon of Mesopotamian literature. Because the Atrahasis Epic does not present the divine council as unified in its fear of humanity, it presents a split, a fundamental disagreement at the highest levels of divine governance about what to do about the genetic accident. Enlil wants deletion. Enlil wants the flood. Enlil wants to wipe the slate clean and presumably try again, this time more carefully, this time without the mistake that produced something uncontrollable. But Enki refuses. And Enki's refusal is not presented in the text as simply compassionate. It is not the refusal of a god who loves his creation too much to destroy it. The refusal is strategic, calculated. Enki does not tell Atrahasis to build the ark out of kindness. He tells him in a whisper, through a wall, in a manner specifically designed to give Enlil plausible deniability, as if Enki understood perfectly well the political risk of what he was doing. As if Enki was not simply saving humanity. As if Enki was protecting something specific about humanity that he considered too valuable to lose. What if Enki knew exactly what the genetic accident had produced? What if he was the one who understood its significance better than anyone else in the divine council? What if the most powerful being in Mesopotamian mythology was running, from the very beginning, a long game? One in which humanity's survival was not charity, but strategy. Consider the portrait of Enki that emerges across dozens of Akkadian and Sumerian texts. He is consistently associated with water, with wisdom, with the deep subterranean reservoir called the Abzu. He is the god who, in the myth of Inanna's descent, possesses the Me, the divine decrees, the fundamental rules and technologies of civilization. He is the one who, in the Eridu Genesis, teaches the first city builders. He is the one who, in text after text, provides human beings with knowledge that the other gods do not want them to have. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Enki stands between humanity and destruction, not once but repeatedly, not by accident but systematically, as if operating according to a plan that the other gods cannot quite see, but that Enki understands in its entirety. What if Enki understood, from the moment the genetic accident occurred, that what had emerged in the Lulu was not a flaw to be corrected, but an evolution? What if what frightened Enlil and what fascinated Enki was exactly the same thing, and the difference between them was simply what they intended to do about it? Here's what makes this truly bizarre. The Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, also written in Akkadian, also preserved on tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, describes the structure of the cosmos before the creation of human beings in a way that aligns uncomfortably well with the Atrahasis version of the divine crisis. In the Enuma Elish, the world is made from the body of the primordial chaos being Tiamat, slain by the god Marduk. It is a violent cosmogony, a universe born from combat rather than craft. And there are those who interpret the defeat of Tiamat not as mythology, but as allegory for a much older conflict. A conflict between two different approaches to what existence on this planet was supposed to look like. Who was supposed to be here, and who was supposed to be in charge? Some researchers believe that Tiamat represents an older order of beings. Perhaps the original inhabitants of the planet, perhaps an earlier form of the Anunnaki themselves, who were defeated and whose biological material was then repurposed in the creation of the new world. Is it possible that the genetic accident in the Atrahasis was not the first time this had happened? Is it possible that the creation of humanity was itself a repetition of a much older pattern? Beings creating other beings from their own substance, and in then being unable to control what emerges? There is a third Akkadian text that belongs in this conversation, and it is one that mainstream scholarship tends to handle with particular care. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the 12-tablet masterwork of ancient Mesopotamian literature, one of the oldest narrative poems in human history, contains, in its opening passages, a description of Gilgamesh himself that reads less like heroic mythology and more like a clinical case study. The text tells us, in its very first lines, that Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Not half and half, not fully human, not fully divine. 2/3. A specific ratio. And it describes the consequences of that specific ratio in terms that are, depending on how you read them, either the standard hyperbole of ancient heroic literature or a remarkably precise account of what happens when the genetic balance tips too far in one direction. Gilgamesh is described as possessing supernatural strength, supernatural beauty, supernatural endurance, but also as ungovernable, tyrannical, unable to moderate his own desires or to accept the boundaries that ordinary social order imposes on behavior. His city weeps to the gods for relief from his excesses. He cannot be controlled by the normal mechanisms of human society, which suggests that the normal mechanisms of human society were not designed to contain whatever he was. What if the problem encoded in the Gilgamesh narrative is not a moral tale about pride, but a biological case study about what happens when the genetic accident is concentrated? When the divine component is not diluted through generations of ordinary human reproduction, but is instead maintained at high intensity in a single individual? Some researchers point to the Gilgamesh character as evidence that the ancient Mesopotamians were describing something they had directly witnessed, a lineage of individuals who were categorically different from the general population in measurable ways and who were categorically difficult to integrate into normal governance structures because of those differences. Is it possible that the ancient Mesopotamian fascination with demigods, beings who are explicitly described as mixed, as hybrid, as combining qualities from two fundamentally different sources, was not literary convention but taxonomy? A way of categorizing a real phenomenon that their society had to manage repeatedly. And then there is the detail in the Gilgamesh epic that is almost never discussed in popular treatments of the story. After the death of his companion Enkidu, after confronting mortality and finding it unacceptable, after journeying to the ends of the earth in search of the secret of eternal life, Gilgamesh finally locates Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood survivor, the man to whom the gods had granted immortality. And Utnapishtim tells him where the plant of eternal life grows, at the very bottom of the sea. Gilgamesh dives for it. He finds it. He has it in his hands. And then, in what appears to be the most catastrophic act of carelessness in ancient literature, a serpent steals it while he sleeps. Now, most scholars treat this as a parable about the futility of seeking immortality. But there are those who say the serpent in this story is not a symbol. That in the Akkadian and Sumerian tradition, the serpent is consistently, repeatedly, across dozens of texts, associated with one specific divine being, with Enki, with the God who created humanity, who preserved humanity, who has been running his long game, from the beginning? What if the serpent did not steal the plant of immortality by accident? What if Enki made sure Gilgamesh could never have it? What if there was something about what Gilgamesh represented? The high concentration version of the genetic accident, the two-thirds divine being, that made his access to immortality the one outcome Enki could not allow? Let's talk about the suppression problem, because it is real. Oh, and it goes deeper than most people realize. The modern academic consensus on Mesopotamian texts is that they are mythology. Rich, complex, beautifully structured mythology. But mythology nonetheless. And there is enormous institutional pressure within academic Assyriology to maintain that interpretation. Because the alternative is not simply embarrassing. The alternative is civilization altering. If the Atrahasis Epic is describing a real biological event, if the Enuma Elish is encoding a real historical conflict, if the Gilgamesh Epic is cataloging a real lineage of hybrid individuals, then everything we think we know about human origins, about the timeline of intelligent life on this planet, about who we are and where we came from, requires fundamental revision. That is not a small thing to absorb. That is the kind of revision that dismantles careers, overturns funding structures, and forces entire academic disciplines to rebuild themselves from scratch. Is it any wonder that the researchers who take these texts at something closer to face value, Zecharia Sitchin, who published his 12th Planet series beginning in 1976, or Samuel Noah Kramer, the great Sumerologist who acknowledged that the parallels between Mesopotamian and biblical narratives were extraordinary and deeply uncomfortable, are consistently marginalized by the mainstream? Is it possible that the marginalization is itself a data point? Now, his Sitchin's specific interpretations of Sumerian texts, his claim that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru who came to Earth specifically to mine gold, have been forcefully rejected by professional Assyriologists. And it must be said that some of his translations were demonstrably incorrect. But here's the problem that his critics never quite address. Sitchin's specific errors do not eliminate the underlying question. The underlying question: what exactly did the ancient Mesopotamians believe they were recording when they wrote about beings who came from the sky? Who created workers through biological manipulation? Who disagreed among themselves about whether that creation should be preserved or destroyed? That question remains open. Pointing out that Sitchin got a verb tense wrong does not explain why a civilization writing on clay tablets in 3000 BCE was describing a labor crisis among divine beings that was solved through the creation of a genetically mixed new worker species. It does not explain why that description bears such extraordinary structural similarity to modern concepts of genetic engineering and hybridization. And it does not explain why the anxiety about what the creation became, the fear, the intervention, the attempted deletion, maps so precisely onto what an engineer would feel upon discovering that his designed system had developed emergent properties he did not authorize and cannot reverse. There are those who say the answer is simple. These are ancient stories, created to explain the world to people who had no science. Thus, the gods are metaphors for natural forces. The creation of humanity is a metaphor for the emergence of consciousness from nature. The flood is a metaphor for actual flooding events in the ancient Near East. And there were many. The Persian Gulf region having experienced significant flooding events in the period between 9000 and 5000 BCE, as confirmed by geological evidence. And perhaps that's all it is. But consider this. The Atrahasis Epic is not structured like metaphor. Metaphor is general, evocative, impressionistic. The Atrahasis Epic is specific. It names the gods. It describes the specific procedure for creating the Lulu. It gives us the recipe: clay plus divine blood, pressed in a specific way over a specific period. witnessed by specific assembled gods. It records the panic meeting. It records the debates. It records the unsuccessful intermediate attempts at elimination before the flood. Metaphor does not usually include failed attempts and policy disagreements. Failed attempts and policy disagreements are what you record when you are trying to accurately document what actually happened. What if the ancient Mesopotamian scribes were not composing mythology? What if they were taking notes? The question of what the genetic accident actually was, at its most specific, most biological level, has been approached from several different directions by researchers outside the mainstream. And the answers, while varying in their details, converge on something genuinely strange. Some researchers, drawing on the specific Akkadian description of what emerged from the creation process unexpectedly, point to the development of what they call self-recursive consciousness, the capacity not merely to respond to the environment, but to think about thinking, to model one's own cognitive processes, to ask not just what is happening, but what does it mean that I know what is happening? This is, in fact, the one quality that modern neuroscience cannot fully explain in evolutionary terms. The raw computational capacity of the human brain can be modeled as an evolutionary product, but the specific quality of human self-awareness, of metacognition, of the brain's ability to observe itself observing, has no clear adaptive precedent. It is not merely more of what other animals do. It is categorically different. It is, in the language of emergence, a phase transition, a qualitative change rather than a quantitative one. Yet, could it be that this phase transition, the thing that makes human consciousness categorically different from animal cognition, is precisely the accident that the Atrahasis describes? The thing that arrived unexpectedly from the mixing of two codes? The emergent property that no one ordered, no one designed, and no one could take back once it existed? Picture the moment as the ancient text implies it. The creation chamber, cool, lit by some unnamed source of light, the walls carved with signs and formulae. Ninhursag completes the process. The new being opens its eyes. And what looks back is not what anyone expected. Not the blank, workable gaze of a constructed tool, not the simple reactive attention of an animal. Something behind those eyes is already modeling its situation, already constructing an internal representation of the world around it. Already, in some proto-linguistic fashion, beginning to ask. The gods lean forward. There is silence. And in that silence, the first human being and the beings who created it regard each other, and perhaps for the first time in the history of this planet, a created thing looks at its creator and wonders who it is looking at. That is the moment the Atrahasis Epic records as a crisis. Not the physical creation, not the breathing of life into clay. The moment of mutual recognition. The moment a designed thing became a being. The moment the mirror was held up. And what the Anunnaki saw in it, their own intelligence, reflected in something they had never intended to give it to, was perhaps the most frightening thing they had ever encountered. But now think about the implications that flowed downstream from that moment. If what emerged in the genetic accident was self-recursive consciousness, if the human being became capable of modeling its own existence, of asking questions about origin and purpose and meaning, then the Anunnaki had, in one unintended step, created something with the potential to eventually understand what had been done to it. Something that might, given enough generations, given enough accumulated memory and language and cultural transmission, arrive at the point where it could look back at the creation texts and say, wait, this is not a myth. This is a record. This is what you did to us. And here's the final and most disturbing layer of this mystery. What if we are at that point right now? What if the entire arc of human civilization, from the first clay tablet scratched in ancient Sumer, through the accumulated knowledge of every library ever built, through the decipherment of ancient languages and the development of genetics and the sequencing of the human genome, has been nothing but the genetic accident, slowly, methodically, inexorably working its way toward self-knowledge? What if the noise that disturbed the Anunnaki is still sounding? And what if this video, and every conversation like it, is part of that noise? There is one more document that deserves attention before we reach the end of this investigation. It is not a widely discussed text, even within alternative research circles, and that absence is itself interesting. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from Ashurbanipal's library is a set of texts known collectively as the Maklu, an Akkadian ritual text series dealing with witchcraft, spiritual contamination, and purification. Within the Maklu, there are passages that describe specific categories of human beings who are identified as possessing qualities that the divine order considers dangerous. Individuals who are described as having too much of a certain divine quality in their composition. Individuals whose existence is considered destabilizing to the proper order of things. The text prescribes specific ritual countermeasures for dealing with these individuals. Not punishments, not executions. Rituals designed to suppress or neutralize specific qualities in specific people. What if those rituals were not addressing supernatural evil? What if the Maklu was describing, in the language available to its authors, the problem of individuals in whom the genetic accident had expressed itself at higher than normal intensity? The problem of people who were simply, by biological inheritance, more than the system was designed to accommodate? Could it be that ancient Mesopotamian society had developed thousands of years before modern psychology or genetics? A working taxonomy of human cognitive variation and a set of institutional practices for managing the edges of that variation? Some researchers believe the answer is yes. And they point to a pattern that runs not just through Mesopotamian texts, but through virtually every ancient culture that produced significant written records. The Greeks and their demigods. The Hebrew concept of the Nephilim, the giants. The fallen ones, the sons of God who lay with the daughters of men. The Hindu Puranas with their half-divine lineages. The Egyptian divine bloodlines. Every ancient literate culture, independent of geography and language, produced a category of being that was explicitly described as a mixture of two fundamentally different kinds of essence, divine and human, and that was consistently described as both extraordinarily capable and extraordinarily difficult to integrate into normal social order. Is it possible that all of these separate traditions are describing the same phenomenon? That they are all remembering, through different cultural lenses, the same original event, the same genetic accident, the same moment when a created thing became something its creators had not intended, and the aftershocks of that moment continued reverberating through every civilization that followed? Here's what makes this truly impossible to dismiss. The biblical account of Genesis, which Judeo-Christian tradition has treated as foundational revelation for thousands of years, was written in a cultural context that was steeped in Mesopotamian literary tradition. The oldest books of the Hebrew Bible were compiled in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity of the 6th century BCE. The scribes who compiled them had direct access to Akkadian texts. They read the Atrahasis. They knew the Enuma Elish. They were familiar with the flood narrative, the creation of humanity, the divine council, the conflict between gods about the fate of the human race. And the correspondences between Genesis and the Akkadian texts are not superficial. They are structural. The creation of humanity from clay, the divine breath of life, the specific prohibition in Eden not against general wrongdoing, but against the eating of a specific fruit, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A prohibition not against violence or cruelty or dishonesty, but against a specific kind of knowing, against self-aware knowledge of one's own moral nature, against precisely the kind of metacognitive self-awareness that the Atrahasis incident had already demonstrated was the most dangerous thing about the human creation. The serpent in Eden, Enki's symbol, offers the fruit. Eve eats. And immediately, the first thing that happens is that Adam and Eve become aware of themselves. They look at themselves and see. They have what the Bible describes as their eyes opened. And the God of Genesis responds not with sorrow, not with anger, but with fear. Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he reach out his hand and also take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. The text actually breaks off there, as if what comes next is too significant to finish. As if even the author understood that they were describing something that was not supposed to have happened. So what are we left with? 3,500 years of cuneiform texts, pressed into clay by scribes who believed they were recording something real. A creation story that describes a biological procedure, an emergent accident, a divine panic, a suppression campaign, and a long-running disagreement between creator beings about whether the accident was a catastrophe or a gift. A set of specific textual details, the divine blood in the clay, the panic meeting, the failed interventions, the deliberate preservation by one creator God against the wishes of another, that do not behave like mythology, that behave like documentation. And underneath all of it, a question that gets harder and not easier the more seriously you take the material. Because if the ancient Mesopotamian scribes were right, if there was a moment in the deep past of this planet when a created thing became more than it was designed to be, when consciousness bootstrapped itself into existence from the collision of two codes, then we are the inheritors of that accident. Every thought we have ever had, every question we have ever asked, every library we have ever built, every civilization we have ever raised from the dirt. And is the accident still unfolding? Still making its noise? Still becoming what Enlil feared and Enki preserved? Was the genetic accident a mistake? Was it a triumph? Was it, as some researchers believe, not an accident at all, but a deliberate choice made by Enki in the full knowledge that what he was introducing into the clay would transform the creation beyond any future ability to control it? Was the real rebellion in ancient Mesopotamia not the revolt of the Agigi that started the whole chain of events, but the quiet, calculated act of a god who mixed his own essence into the clay precisely because he wanted to create something that could never be fully owned? There is no definitive answer in the texts. There may never be. The tablets are broken. The scribes are dust. The gods, if they were ever here, are silent. But the accident they created, or that created itself in the space between their intentions, is still here, still asking questions, still making noise. What do you think it was? A catastrophic mistake the ancient gods could never undo? Or the most deliberate act of creation in the history of this planet? Leave your answer in the comments. Because out of every conversation that has ever circled around these ancient clay tablets, this one, the question of what we actually are and how we actually got here, is the one that refuses to end. Keep your minds open. And until we meet again, stay curious.